Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Kerman with Leading Edge Seminars, and I'm very excited and happy to welcome you to today's virtual lunch with Pat Ogden. Uh, Thanks a lot for taking the time to join us wherever you are. I know these are difficult times, so my heart goes out to many people who are struggling both with the consequences of the pandemic and these terrible, terrible fires in the West Coast. So if you're one of them, know that there are many people thinking of you, and I'm glad you could join us. Uh, Before I introduce Pat, I'd like to just tell you a few things about what we're up to, because we're starting a whole new season. And previously, that season would have been in a meeting room in Toronto. And when the pandemic started, we started doing free stuff and then webinars. And we started at the end of March. And what we realized right away was that people like being with people. And then, of course, if you're a mental health professional, that's what you do. And it was just wonderful to see the feedback, the interaction that went on online. And to that end, we decided to kind of transform what we do into kind of webinars and ways to connect, both during our webinars, during our virtual lunches, offering question and answer periods with our webinar speakers a week or two after they're done. So you can come back and talk a little bit more, get some more questions answered, be with your peers. And we're doing some monthly events as well, town halls and other kinds of cafes. All of the information is on our website. It's kind of too much to go into now, but we're looking forward to just promoting these ways of connecting. Actually, the next connecting events are what we call a buzz cafe for people who are subscribers and with many benefits, and a town hall meeting on September 28th, which will be for everyone to come together, and we're going to figure out what we want to talk about. And over the months, once a month, we'll meet, and it gives a chance for therapists around the world to get together. So again, read all about what we're doing. It's going to be interesting times. Everything we're doing is going to be live and on demand. So if you ever want to attend something, you just have to sign up for it. You'll get the link for it soon after it's over. So don't worry about missing things. If you can't be there, we'll be happy to send you that information. In terms of a few things coming up, this week we have Kate Truitt, who is the developer of Havening, and I wonder if Pat knows much about that. I can ask you later. Frank Anderson is doing the first of 6 sessions on internal family systems, certain issues that often don't get covered as much in his regular trainings. And next week we have Frank Ostasecki, who's an amazing person who talks about compassion and grief and loss. Lots of stuff is going to be going on over the next few months. I want to introduce you to Emily, who's on our screen, and she's going to be kind of the person who's in charge of this event. She'll be taking your questions and answers. If there are problems, whatever, go to the chat box, and she's the one to communicate with if you have questions, because we'll certainly leave time for those towards the end of our session. So Pat, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
I was looking forward to meeting you in a meeting room in Toronto in November after lots of attempts to get you to get here. You said, yeah, I'll come, and then you're not able to do this. So at least we're doing this now. For those, many of you would say Pat needs no introduction, but we have hundreds of people here, and some might be curious, and you've heard of Pat Ogden, and you probably know that she's a pioneer in somatic psychology, and she's the developer of the sensory psychotherapy method, which is a body-oriented therapy, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. It's been informed by contributions from the fields of attachment, neuroscience, and disassociation. Of course, Pat's written several books, and she is really one of the main influencers of all kinds of therapy that goes on these days. Even people who haven't read her books or attended her workshops have been influenced, because today, certainly more than years ago, talking about more than talk therapy head to head, the therapists need to function in a different kind of a way to get more success, especially with people with trauma. It's kind of more accepted now than certainly it was. So Pat, thanks and welcome again. And I have a first question I'm going to ask everybody, and I'm going to ask you this question about how you started, how you made a decision to become a therapist. Sometimes it's an incident, sometimes it's a teacher, some strange occurrence happens, you say, I think this is what I want to do with my life. Do you remember what that was for you?
Well, I don't think it was just one incident, but two major factors were in the 70s. I was working in a psychiatric hospital teaching yoga and dance. I mean, teaching yoga from a book because nobody was, I never had taken a yoga class. But what I discovered was that the patients who did those classes seemed to get better. And that really piqued my curiosity as to the role of the body in healing. And now, now I understand it much more because in terms of the polyvagal theory, like the yoga classes were very calming, very relaxing. So, but without the fear, and that's associated with a dorsal vagal response and trauma. And the dance classes were super energetic, super sympathetic arousal, but also again without the fear. So I think that's why they got better. But I was really curious about just the role of the body in healing. And then I met Ron Kurtz when I was working in the psychiatric hospital. And I don't know if you all know Ron. Ron's the founder of the Hakomi method. And he was my mentor, my best friend. He passed away in 2011. But he was the first person that I met who thought that the body could be a viable target of therapeutic intervention. So that was like astonishing to me that somebody was already thinking along these lines. And so then I moved to Boulder with Ron and studied all kinds of body work, and that meeting him really did change my life.
And you started off in a psychiatric hospital. And what were you doing there when you were observing this yoga and this movement? Although it sounds like a very progressive psychiatric hospital for its time. Was it, or is...
Well, I mean, this was the 70s, and there weren't all these regulations. My job was as a technician, but I was allowed to do anything. So I led group therapy, sometimes with a psychiatrist, sometimes by myself. I led art therapy classes, and I led yoga and dance classes. And it was fascinating to me what helped and what didn't help the clients. And that's also where I learned, this might be sacrilegious, but where I learned not to trust diagnoses at all, because people would come to that hospital, and and when they came in, everybody was kind of open to them and like what the problem was and how we could help. And then they would get these diagnoses, and then they were like in this little box, especially if you got borderline personality disorder. And all of a sudden, all the possibilities were truncated, and that was a terrible thing. I thought, I don't know if it's still that way, but so yeah, I learned that in a psychiatric hospital too.
How did you get introduced to Ron Kurtz, and what were the first awakenings you had to his approach?
Well, I went to a lecture that he was giving. I was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and the lecture was on macrobiotics of all things. But it was one of those things where you just knew that there was a connection. And so I went up to him afterwards and I asked him if he did sessions, and he said yes. And I said, well, I don't have any money. And he said, that's okay. And so I went to him and for a session, and he asked me to hold out my hand and say, Daddy, 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 because my father was killed when I was 3. And I was like, what? But what I felt was this intense like fear, and I wouldn't do it. And he said, oh, that's okay. And then we just started talking, and he asked me if I'd organize a workshop, and I did. And but that little incident, which I haven't thought about for decades, probably years anyway, it made such an impression because he was combining an action with, my history, with calling for my father. And it was like overwhelming. It was way too much, but it showed me just the power of physical action connected with psychological history. Yeah.
I guess if you had been used to talk therapy, you thought you just investigate or explore the meaning of that death, and he was challenging you in a different kind of a way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then later, after I moved to Boulder, I got really interested in Rolfing and became certified much later in the Rolf method. But I would go to my Rolfer. Do you all know Rolfing? It's a hands-on body work that if your body is not aligned with gravity like this, it'll help your body find its alignment. And it's beautiful, powerful work, strong influence on sensorimotor psychotherapy. But going to my Rolfer, Emmett Hutchins, and as he started to shift how I lived in my body, all these emotions and memories would come up, and he'd say, well, go talk to your therapist about that. But then I'd go to my therapist and they wouldn't be immediate, So I really wanted to bring the work with the body and the movement and the shift in the structure and posture together with psychotherapy. Yeah.
And what would those early sessions look like compared to how you're working now? Like, what was the evolution of starting to put these ideas together, the body and...
Well, early on, in 1981, Ron and I and a few others founded the Hakomi Institute. And that same year, I remember having breakfast with Ron, and I said, I love Hakomi, but I'm much more interested in the body and actually helping people shift their very structure and how they live in their bodies. And Hakomi wasn't following that track. And so Ron said, well, why don't you start your own branch and call it Hakomi Bodywork? So that was 1981, and I did, and I was using hands-on table work. I had studied postural integration. I wasn't certified in Rolfing yet, but I'd studied lots of movement work and taught massage and postural integration actually for a few years. And so I was combining this hands-on table work with psychotherapy. And I'd also, gone to social work school in Tennessee. So I had some background in counseling and all. But what I found out was that it just wasn't really teachable, because people had to have a good, solid background in psychology and also a good, solid background in structural, deep body work. So I gave that up in about 1985, and then started just, doing the same work really, but without the hands-on body work, but still looking for the same changes. Like if a client comes in and their shoulders are up as a psychotherapy client, I'm tracking that from the beginning and looking at how their psychology participates to this posture. And what we're looking for that to shift. So it's the same, only without the hands-on table work. Yeah.
You're a real integrator, and I know you've really thought a lot about attachment theory and how to also integrate that into your practice. What was your first entry into really looking at attachment as such an important issue, which also wasn't the conversation so much back 20, 30 years ago?
No, I would say that was through Ron. Ron was very interested in how early childhood relationships shaped belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't called attachment theory, but that was a real strength of his work, I think. I think he was way ahead of his time. Mm-hmm. So he was looking at that imprint of caregiver-child interaction and how that, he didn't talk about implicit memory, but that's what he was working with, how the unconscious implicit memory then, as Alan Shore would talk about, the right brain implicit self is dominant for human behavior. So attachment theory came much later to me, and through Alan Shore and others. I learned about John Bowlby's work, which was phenomenal, and Yeah. I mean, it's so complicated. People can't be
It is.
divided into
You,
categories. But
you
that,
need a big flip chart. I remember one moment that from many, many workshops we've done, you participated in a session we videoed in Toronto. It was in New York, and you with Philip Bromberg.
oh,
I thought, Philip Bromberg, for those of you, is a very famous psychoanalyst, and he was talking about how impressed he was with your work. And to me, that was such a illuminating moment to see what kind of walls breaking down between what I had thought of in my own limited mind as these kind of walls between different therapies and understandings and approaches. What's your
yeah.
relationship with him been like, with
Oh,
Philip Bromberg?
well, he passed away this year. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah, we became very close friends. It was funny how our relationship happened. Before that workshop, I think, or that conference that you came to, we had done another one, Alan Shore and Philip and I and some others. And Alan and I had the idea it'd be great to do another one with Philip. So I wrote to Philip and said, would you do this with us? And he said, I don't have time. And I said, well, look, why don't I'll just present one of my video sessions with a client through the lens of your work, which I really didn't know that well, but I figured I could do that, and he said, okay. And all he would have to do is talk about the session. So I don't know if you all are familiar with his work. He's written several books. He's the most poetic writer, most beautiful writer in our field. But I hadn't really studied his work. I had gotten the book Awakening the Dreamer. I think this was in 2006. But I didn't know that what he was talking about was that the dreamer was the therapist, not only the client. So I kept sending him videotapes, and he kept saying, no, 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 no. He said, we have to see you struggle. You have to get into an enactment with your client and not know what you're doing and be really frustrated and helpless. He said, that's the kind of tape I want to see. And so I found a tape that illustrated just that. And I wrote him and I said, I'm not going to do it. It's way too vulnerable. Because at that time, then I got what therapeutic enactments really are about. They're about your own unconscious, implicit self interacting with the client, but you're not aware of it. So you're just getting more and more stuck and more frustrated. And I knew about transference and countertransference, but this took it to a whole nother level. And that was the brilliance of Philip's teaching, was that he normalized therapeutic enactments. He said they are not mistakes. I really grew to appreciate them as like the implicit self of the therapist and the client interacting at that implicit level where, relational negotiations have failed in the past. And if you work it through, you both get to a higher level of organization, So he talked me into doing it. And now everything I teach, I reference the enactments and all, because I think that, I grew up in a humanistic tradition, whereas if you weren't able to, really accept your client and everything, that there's something really kind of wrong with you. And so Philip really has helped the world understand that that's not the case, that those times when we are angry with our clients or don't accept them or whatever, those are opportunities for both of us. So that was how we became friends. And he was just a brilliant, brilliant clinician. A great loss to our field. Yeah.
Well, I want to just shift our focus and also let everyone know, because some people are signing in a little bit later, we're going to be open for questions pretty soon. So I'm going to shift around, but feel free when it's question time to come back to whatever you would like to ask, and just put that in the chat line, and Emily will call people to the screen to ask you questions. One thing I learned about you, Pat, was you were ahead of a lot of people looking at white privilege and racism and relationships between, white therapists and marginalized communities and clients. So tell me about your thoughts, how that developed in you, and what you see happening right now around that issue, which is now, the talk.
Yeah. Well, for me, it was pretty humbling because my brother married a Jamaican woman, and so I have two nephews that I'm super close to. They identify as Black, and nieces and grandnieces. So I grew up, well, not grew up. In my adult life, my family became mixed race, and I in the '60s, you and I were talking about this before. I was in civil rights demonstrations, et cetera, et cetera. So I really, with an arrogance I think typical of white privilege, I thought I had a handle on race relations. And then in 2015, after Ferguson happened, I suggested to Dan Siegel, Alan Shore, Marion Solomon, Bonnie Goldstein, we were on the board for the UCLA Interpersonal Neurobiology conferences. And I said, I think we need to do something on diversity and culture. And they agreed. And it was really through that conference where I realized I knew nothing really. I had been so naive. So at that conference, I started collaborating with some African-American colleagues, Medria Connolly and Brian Nicholson, and I learned so much. And I realized that our whole profession is really in a Eurocentric tradition with methods and interventions designed for that population. Even sensorimotor psychotherapy. Like I never had looked at how actions and movement express privilege, oppression dynamics. So I started doing a lot of really deep exploration, and I started analyzing my work in a whole different way. And speaking out about how blind, honestly, we've all been, and how blind that I've been for all these years. So and at that time, I developed a think tank with Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute with people of color involved in the institute, and it grew to be an anti-racism, anti-oppression think tank. And we've just completed a book, which will be out next year, about sensorimotor psychotherapy in context, where we're really looking at the history and even of attachment theory, and all the major influences on my work. They've all been from a Eurocentric Western perspective, and looking at how that silences other voices, and we tried to illustrate in the chapters through our collaboration. They became consultants on this book, how we can bring these issues to the forefront in therapy practice. But it's an ongoing learning, and now it's really becoming paramount in the United States. I mean, I think we're finally, when you have a client who's a sexual abuse survivor and they've kept it a secret all these years, and then finally it comes out and then the healing can begin. I feel like as a nation, we're almost like at that place right now with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, all the killings and the murders. And so, I feel a really strong responsibility to speak to these issues,
In terms of the Institute and your teachings, can you share some ideas that people might find useful to become more sensitive, or things to look into before your book comes out?
You mean what we've been looking at, kind of?
Yeah, so what you've been looking at and thoughts you might have that might be helpful to therapists now who are realizing that there's work to be done in their own practice.
Oh gosh, there's just so much, I mean, I know that D'Angelo's book on white privilege has come under some criticism from BIPOC right now, but I did find her book very illuminating in terms of all the nuances of white privilege. I found Joy DeGruy's work. I don't know. Well, you all are mostly Canadians. You're in a slightly different situation than the States, but her book on post-traumatic slave syndrome was really useful to me. There's so many great resources. Ibram's book on becoming an anti-racist. There's so many resources.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that. And it really is an area that's opening up in a way that's very good to see.
Mm-hmm.
So just one more general psychotherapy question. You know, you've been a leader and you've seen changes. Where do you see if you were predicting where psychotherapy was going in the future with what we know now, neuroscience, the integration of ideas of race and culture, would you have some kind of thought like hopefully in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, therapy might look like this? That's a tough question, and there's no right answer.
Yeah. Well, I hope that we can get, honestly, I always feel, a little on the spot saying these things, but this is how I feel. I hope we can get away from somehow evidence-based treatment so that the voices of traditions that have been effective for decades and centuries can be integrated into our work. I think right now, I don't, at least here, the methods and all that get funding from the government are evidence-based on research that are with a very narrow population that are usually white people, even nuclear families, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, attachment theory is even, well, not primary, is primarily based on that, even though they've done a lot of cross-cultural research as well. But those, I would hope that we get more equanimity in our diagnosis and treatment so that marginalized people aren't stereotyped the way that is still going on in the world.
Okay. I'd like to open it up to everyone. We have a big Zoom screen, and you're welcome to contact Emily through the chat line, and she'll call people to the screen. If you don't want to be on the screen, you can write a question or just say you'll ask the question without video. Emily, do we have some questions?
Yeah. Our first question was actually an email, and just so everyone knows, you're always welcome to send me an email if you have a question that you'd like to ask anonymously. So this question comes from someone who says that their child was involved in a serious crime and is awaiting a trial. What this person witnessed and the people involved and the danger they were in, I'm very worried she now has PTSD. One of her bail conditions is not to be online, which makes therapy very difficult. Is there anything I can do to support her during this awful time? She doesn't live with me, and she's asked to remain anonymous for the safety as it may compromise, as her safety may be compromised because of all of this. Any suggestions?
Well, this is complicated, and I don't, of course, know this person. One thing that I've been trying to teach people, especially when there's ongoing trauma, which we are having right now in terms of the pandemic, it's an ongoing trauma. People of color live with the ongoing threat of trauma all the time, and this person is living with threat, right, and dysregulation. So something that comes to mind is that, you know, when our arousal is too high or too low, outside of that window of tolerance, it really interferes with our regulatory capacity and our resilience. So if there's one thing that we can do is to learn how to notice when our arousal is too high or too low, and to do something immediately to bring it back in, and to try to stay with that experience of the arousal being within a window. Because what that does is, if we can savor and stay with a calmer, more regulated state, that can start to shift the brain. So I would encourage her to talk with her kid about just doing things that help them feel better, and doing it quickly, right? Because the longer we stay in those states, the more traumatized we're going to be. Does that make sense to people? Mm-hmm. So even things like one of my son had a horrible experience where he witnessed his best friend who fell and split open his head, and he was the only one there, and there's blood everywhere, and it was traumatic for both of them, and for the person who witnesses that, you know, to be able to metabolize the catecholamines, to do things right away as soon as possible to make him feel better, because our bodies are wired, you know, to take action when there's trauma. But in our day and age, we're not running away from tigers, so we don't usually use up the adrenaline and all through physical action. So I said to my son, you know, why don't you just try going for a really strenuous run, like just for 15, 20 minutes. And just that was a regulatory action that helped bring his arousal into a window. So to help this person find and identify activities, resources, listening to music, going for a run, doing some yoga, taking a bath, that will try to bring the arousal in to the window of tolerance quickly, might be one thing to do. The more we focus on the trauma and the future and towards, you know, the terror of what's going to happen, the more our arousal is going to be outside of that window.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Barbara Jones-Warwick. Barbara, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi. Pat, I was wondering about the use of sensorimotor work with trauma survivors who I'm encountering this a fair bit lately in my work with sexual violence survivors, but women who have been diagnosed with conversion disorder, which a friend of mine said, oh yeah, that's what they used to call hysteria. And I bristle at those terms. But particularly what happens is when, even indirectly, I try to address the trauma, there's this temporary paralysis of various body parts. And just wondering if, am I ill-advised to be trying to use some sensory motor work, or should I be, you know, trying a specific approach? And I know this may be more case specific than you can answer, so a general response is quite acceptable. Thank you.
Well, it makes me think, Barbara, of that video that I finally settled on showing with Philip Bromberg and Ellen Shore, because this woman also went into a paralysis. She could not move. Huh. And Alan talked about it as a conversion disorder. This is what would have been diagnosed as a conversion disorder. Right. And to me, it was a freeze response, you know, mm-hmm. where her muscles were rigid, and she literally could not move. So mm-hmm. it became kind of the task became finding out what would be needed for her to find action. And I don't know, I mean, there are so many different interventions you could try, like if it's precipitated by a particular event that she's recalling, you can go back, like rewind the tape in that memory to the moments in time where movement was available. And it's almost like watching a movie in slow motion, you know? So she can stay really sensitive to her body and start to find those preparatory movements that of wanting to, I mean, these are like instinctive movements, right? Of wanting to fight back or run away or scream for help, and find the moment in the memory where those movements are available and then help those movements be executed. That's what I was trying to do with this client. But it didn't, that wasn't effective with this client. What was finally effective with this client was as I moved further and further away from her, she was able then to get through that immobility. So I mean, I think sensorimotor psychotherapy would be great to experiment with this client.
Okay. Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. Our next question is from Samia, who has asked, can therapeutic enactment be used with people who are racialized? And does training change based on our new understanding of culture and race?
Does training change based on our new understanding of culture and race? Yes, training does change. You know, this is a very interesting question. Somebody was talking to me the other day about exploring microaggressions in therapy as a form of therapeutic enactment. And I immediately had a visceral response of, no, you don't want to go there, because a therapeutic enactment is like where, you know, the unconscious of the therapist interfaces with the unconscious of the client. Like in that videotape that I showed, I was working with Philip, I was working with a client whose mother was very invasive. And my mother, I think after my father was killed, now you know all this history about me, so I could just talk about it, she was more withdrawn, and I was always trying to reach her. So that was coming out unconsciously in that session where I was moving forward towards my client, trying to reach her as I did with my mom, but this was all unconscious. So in that enactment, my client and I had equal histories, equal, you know, interface of our histories, like a hand in glove fit. Are you all following me? I hope this is just making sense.
Seeing lots of nodding.
Okay, good. With race relations, it's not the same. Like it's almost to turn like a privilege oppression dynamic into a therapeutic enactment feels to me almost like a blaming the victim scenario. You know, like if we take a microaggression, for example, like if you, which we all do a microaggression with your clients. I mean, we've grown up in such a racist society, I don't think we can help but do that. Like, we have a lot of examples in the new book. One that comes to me is an example that we used of a composite case with a Native American who had an alcohol problem. And the therapist said, oh, that makes sense because so many of your people have problems with alcohol. Okay, that was a microaggression, right? And where it was like blaming of that group of people. Now, if you tried to work that out as a therapeutic enactment, where the client is supposed to take equal, you know, responsibility for their part, and you take responsibility for your part, and you negotiate it together, that can be like a reenactment of privilege oppression dynamics. So I can't think of a case where privilege oppression dynamics show up where there's an exertion of privilege or microaggression, where I would want to treat that like a therapeutic enactment. I think the person of privilege has to take responsibility for it. Complicated though. I mean, and to somebody given an example where it would be different. Yeah.
We had one request of asking if the video with Alan Shore and Philip Bromberg is still available to watch.
No, it isn't. Well, because I only show client videos in person, which has been a problem switching to online format. Because if in a conference where I can see people and I can say, do you know this person, et cetera, and make sure nobody's videotaping the client, I can show them, but it's not available. I can't share my client material publicly.
Okay. Our next question comes from Noel. Noel, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi.
Oh.
There you are.
Yeah. I know.
Sorry about that. Hi. So, okay, this is a pretty complicated question. I apologize, but I'm curious here. You were talking about the kind of like the silver linings, I call the positive outcomes that come with having when a therapist is having difficulties with a specific client, maybe feeling inferior, or they may consider the client a problem situation, or those are good examples of repair opportunities. You were speaking to that, right?
Yes.
You follow me so far? Okay. I was wondering if you have any. Now I'm taking it a little step further. If we consider the supervisor and supervisee, okay, having that same difficulty, and then you consider culture. Do you have any good sources, references, study material that speaks to this positive outcome that can come from these repair opportunities? Not just with the client and the therapist, but again, taking that step further between the supervisor and the supervisee, because you can imagine that.
Yes, there are some references, but I would have to look them up. They're not at the tip of my fingers right now.
Okay.
Well, there's one person, oh, come on, what's her name? Carmen Diaz, I think, who's written a lot about, do you know who she is?
I've heard the name.
Yeah. There's a great article around transference and countertransference and cross-cultural relationships. I can't think of the name of it right now. And there's also some good articles by, there's one by Shelley Harrell, I think, on supervision.
Shelley Narell?
Yeah, Shelley Harrell. She's on our
Harrell.
advisory board. She's at Pepperdine. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, it's her article around supervision that's actually quite good.
Okay.
But you know, that's the difficulty, as Philip would talk about, is when you're in the midst of an enactment, is to try to find the solution yourself as a therapist. I mean, he really emphasized, and I really learned from him about how it has to be negotiated relationally. So, you know, we were talking once, and I asked him, well, what would you, if you felt like something's going on, you know, you felt like mad at your client or frustrated or like something was going on between you. I said, what would you do? And he said, well, he said, you might just sit with it and, you know, watch it. He said, but you wouldn't want to jump to any conclusions. He said, you might want to say, you know, I'm kind of feeling something might be going on between us. I wonder if you're sensing anything. So you're opening it up to a dialogue, you know, and that's that relational negotiation that can be so healing for both parties. And I mean, Philip's work, you know, he doesn't write so much about culture, cross-cultural, but he gives beautiful examples of therapeutic enactments in all his writing. So that would be a great resource. Plus, it's
What's the name what's the name of one of the books that you're referring to with Philip?
I really like Awakening the Dreamer.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah, that's, I believe about Standing in the Spaces, the Tsunami, what's the title? The book about, something about the tsunami. All his books are great. He's such a brilliant writer. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm honored to have been able to ask you these questions.
Thank you, Noel. Our next question is from Hannah, and she's asked, what in-session body-based exercises would you recommend to therapists interested in integrating aspects of sensory motor therapy?
What body-based exercises?
Yeah.
Well, that's a very complicated training question. I mean, the first thing I want to say is, well, you have to do our training because it's not so simple. And the reason it's not so simple is that everybody lives in their body in such a unique way. So, I mean, they're generic things like, yeah, you can work with posture. If somebody's slumped, you could work with aligning the posture. But if they don't have the support of their legs under their body and their pelvis, aligning their posture is just going to be effortful. So it's so complicated. You know, I think of Emmett Hutchins in the mid-70s, my golfer that I told you about. The first exercise he had me do, he said, okay, I want you to go home. And he said, I want you to practice walking backwards. And I'm like, what? Walking backwards? And he said, yeah, because you're all about living in the front of your body. You're always on to the next thing. He said, you need to live in the back of your body, walk backwards, get in touch with your back. I mean, that was specific to my body. So in answer to that question, I would say, first of all, start to get really interested in how you live in your body and how everybody lives in their body. Like, if you even look in the screen, everybody's body is different. You know, some shoulders are sloped down, some are up, some heads are forward, some are back. We all live in our body in a way that is so unique to us. And when the best education you can get is free, just learn to track bodies, learn to start to notice all these idiosyncrasies, all these individual ways, and start connecting that with your client's history and presenting problem. Like my not living in the back of my body was very much connected to a belief system, like I'm not good enough, I have to do more, I have to do better. So get curious about the body and see how, I always tell my students, see how the body participates in whatever the presenting problem is. Like if a client has trouble with relationships, you know, and getting support, see if their arms are limp or if they're tense, because that's going to interface with proximity seeking actions like reaching out, right? So if somebody's reaching out like this, which I've had clients do, they probably have some problems with really connecting with people. I'm sorry, I can't give you a just generic answer.
Okay. Our next question comes from Holly. Holly, are you there?
Hi, yes, I am.
Hi.
Hi, Holly.
Hi there. So my question was related to Indigenous culture and kind of traditions. So I work for an Indigenous specific service, and we do a lot of hand drumming and singing, which works really well with clients. And I'm just wondering if that is considered to be part of sensorimotor psychotherapy, because it tends to, people connect well with it. And I'm just wondering if that's a way to incorporate sensorimotor psychotherapy with the clients that we work with.
I mean, absolutely. I think what you're bringing up is such an important point that you want to find ways to capitalize on the traditions of the people that you work with. You know, whatever that tradition is, and definitely the traditions of Indigenous peoples, because it's such a rich history. So I would say it's a part of every good therapy that works, sensorimotor psychotherapy included. We do work with drumming and sound and sometimes music and singing. So, yeah. I remember Ron said once, this was way long time ago, I said something about, well, what really makes good therapy, you know? And he said, whatever works, you know, whatever works. And that's, I think that's where we can really draw on the culture that our client inhabits, you know. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's great that you're doing that work.
Thank you. Our next question is from Sharon, and she's very curious about your choice of body-centered movement in psychotherapy. So, for example, what was it about yoga in the 60s and 70s that informed your practice? Using dance, what forms of dance? And is there another example of bringing non-Eurocentric practices into the work, or was it more about your own familiarity with the movements?
Well, I think what Holly just brought up is a very good example about bringing non-Eurocentric practices. For me, I mean, as a child, my body was my resource. I was extremely active. I grew up in the country. And my mother put me in dance class when I was 7 because she knew I was going to be really tall. I'm like over 6 feet tall. And she was an artist. And she said, well, if you're going to be tall, you're going to be graceful. So I was in dance class, and I remember clearly Mrs. Bays, when I was 7 or 8 years old, she was trying to teach us about that dancer's poise and that alignment in our body, you know, and I just got it. I still remember that feeling. I just got the feeling of it. So I was always really interested in dance. I studied modern dance for 10 years growing up, and then I studied jazz and hip hop and other things, but I was too tall to ever be in dance recitals and stuff, except as very much background. But it was always a love of mine. So I just, whatever dance people wanted to do back in the 70s, in the psych hospital, I did a lot of line dancing because that was popular back then. I've lost track of the question.
Well, thank you very much. Our next question comes.
Wait, I don't know if I answered. Did I answer the question? That's what got me into
so what was it about the yoga that informed your practice?
Oh, well, you know, the yoga is almost, it's similar to rolfing. It works those areas that have, you know, energy that's blocked, you know. Like Ida Rolf's work was, one of her strong influences was Kundalini yoga, which I didn't know in the 70s, but it was about working with the blockages in the body. And yoga is very much like that, you know. You hold an asana and then you release it, and then the blood starts flowing and something shifts in that area of the body. So, I mean, there's research now with Bessel van der Kolk's, you know, clinic that really shows the value of yoga, but also some of the caveats of yoga. Like, I remember when Bessel was first doing yoga, he said to me, well, the instructor was working with sexual abuse survivors and having them do the happy baby pose. You know that pose where you're on your back and you're grabbing the inside of your feet and your legs are wide open, so you're exposed. And some of the participants, you know, of course, couldn't handle that pose because it had to do with their history. So I think with yoga, like rolfing, like movement work, like dance, it challenges procedural patterns that are formed in your body in reaction to your history of abuse and attachment interactions.
Thank you. We have a question from Jacqueline. Jacqueline, are you there?
Hello?
Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi, thank you very much for your time. I'm very grateful for Pat's time. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to some strategies for calming the nervous system when people are in extreme states of dysregulation and out of their window of tolerance. Strategies that can quickly regulate, for people who are in that extreme ends of hyperarousal and even hypoarousal. I find that we have a lot of great grounding strategies and various tools. But sometimes it's hard to find strategies that really match those extreme states that people are in. So I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that.
Oh gosh, it's a complicated question for several reasons. One, because a physical action that would work for one person, like self-touch, like all of you, if you just do that right now, if you just touch yourself in a way that feels right to you, maybe it's a hand on your heart, or maybe it's hugging yourself, maybe it's a hand on your belly. If you do that right now, you're stimulating oxytocin in your body. Touch from others and self-touch will stimulate oxytocin, which we know, is a relational, about oxytocin. And it can help us calm, can help us feel connected, yeah. But some people, especially if they're dissociative, you try self-touch, and another part, I remember one client where he was highly dysregulated. And he had talked about being able to pet animals, and he was so tender with animals. So I asked if he could just bring some of that touch to himself. And it just made him more dysregulated. He said that I shouldn't be doing this. This reminds me of all the times I've been abused, et cetera, et cetera. So that wasn't a good resource for him, right? So for him, what ended up working was a pushing action. And he pushed against a pillow and against the wall, and that felt strong and good to him. So it gets complicated with somebody who's highly dysregulated when they have dissociative parts, with people with severe trauma do, because the resource for one part won't be good for another part, So you have to experiment, like even posture, like for many people, an aligned, erect posture it feels good, it feels resourcing, it's good for the heart, it's good for your organs, blood can flow, you can get a bigger breath. But that can be really threatening for parts who felt like they shouldn't be seen, right? So then we have to find, okay, is there a place in between a little bit of, alignment that part that can't be seen would be okay with? So it's just not simple. We're so complex,
Well, thank you for that, even, because I think that's helpful even for me to know that, it's sometimes it is an exploration and it's not an easy answer. So
yeah. And you have to find resources that are going to be acceptable to different parts when you're working with these extremes of dissociative disorders.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I want to say thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you, Pat, and thank you for all the questioners. I'll just say a couple of things along with ask something of everyone here in just a few seconds. First, just because of that question, Jacqueline, and for other people, we do have Kate Truitt, who does havening, which is a lot of this stuff, and she's a neuroscientist. She's so interesting. Even if you can't come to our workshop, look up havening. She's coming tomorrow and another time, and she's very interesting. Moving. And Pat will be with us. Pat Ogden will be with us on September 25th for 3 hours to really look at sensorimotor online and the current reality of seeing clients online. So everyone's invited to that. So for everyone, we have a tradition we started. I didn't tell you about this, Pat, but we want to invite everyone to say thank you and goodbye to Pat. We'll unmute everyone's microphone. And thank you. And thank you all for joining in and having lunch together with us all, wherever you are. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Michael. So good to see you both.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Michael,
Thank
bye-bye.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Pat.
Pat.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very
Thank
much.
you.
You.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.